Welcome back to the Human Side of Emergency Management podcast, and I'm your host, Vivian Thompson. Today, we're joined by two leading voices in emergency service wellbeing and trauma psychology, Dr. Hesketh and Dr. Noreen Tehrani. They are the authors of a paper called The Use and Abuse of Dark Humour in Emergency Services. Ian is based at the University of Manchester and is widely recognised for his work on police wellbeing, organisational culture, and the psychological pressures faced by frontline responders. His research explores how officers cope with trauma, how workplace culture shapes behaviour, and how modern policing is influenced by scrutiny, technology, and public expectations. Ian's work sits at the meeting point of operational reality and human psychology, which makes him an ideal voice to help us understand humour, coping, and professionalism in emergency services. Noreen is one of the United Kingdom's most respected trauma specialists. She has decades of experience supporting emergency workers, military personnel, and organisations that operate in high-risk and high-stress environments. Her work focuses on psychological resilience, post-incident recovery, and the emotional mechanisms people use to survive repeated exposure to distressing events. Noreen has spent many years examining how humour, including dark humour, can protect people or harm them, depending on how it is used and the culture around it. Together, Ian and Noreen bring a rare combination of academic insight, clinical experience, and deep familiarity with emergency service culture. Their study draws on the voices of nearly 200 police officers and firefighters. It reveals how humour operates behind the scenes as a coping tool, a cultural glue, and sometimes a professional hazard. When I think about dark humour in emergency services, I go straight back to the years when I stood beside other firefighters in the worst moments of our lives. The fires, the loss, the scenes that stay with you long after you go home. And in my book, Ashes of the Firefighters, I wrote that we learn to carry the unbearable together. And we often describe our emotional bucket when it's overflowing, and that is still true for me today. There were times when the grief in the air was so heavy you could almost taste it. Someone would make a comment that sounded like a joke, but it was not really a joke, it was a lifeline, a way of saying, I see you, I know this is hard, and I'm still here with you. Gosh, I'm getting emotional already. That small moment of humour gave us just enough space to breathe again and keep going. I have seen humour used with care and kindness. I've also seen moments when it missed the mark and someone's pain just sat under the surface. Those experiences taught me that dark humour is not just something people do. It is a way of surviving, and it is a language that only makes sense when you have lived through the same emergency together. That is why this conversation matters, because behind every dark laugh is a human being trying to make sense of something no one should ever have to see. Welcome, Ian and Noreen, to my podcast.
Thank you for inviting us.
I just thought I'd start off with a question about the purpose and the intent of dark humour, because anyone that's not involved in emergency services that may be listening to this probably won't understand what we're talking about. So you both describe dark humour as a release valve that helps responders cope with overwhelming and indescribable situations. From your perspectives, what is the core purpose and intent of dark humour when we use it in emergency services?
I think we need to just think a little bit about the purpose of humour generally. Humour in any situation is something that brings people together. It makes you feel better, gets the endorphins in your brain going, so it lifts your spirit. That's equally important in dark humour. So that's part of the mechanism. But in dark humour, it's slightly different because it's got a much more important purpose in that it distances people from the horror of the circumstances that they are in and gives it a slightly different meaning. So a distancing so that they can keep on going. So the emotion just changes enough. As you were saying earlier, Vivian, it allows you to just get on with what is a horrendous job.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that, Noreen, because it's one of those things. And I guess one of the things which I sort of was trying to get to in my introduction is how do we actually help organisations distinguish between humour that protects our well-being by relieving that pressure and strengthening that team connection, and humour that also can mark distress or reinforces at times those power imbalances and at times causes harm through humiliation, bullying or stereotypes, and enabling these organisations to recognise the difference between humour that supports coping and humour that signals distress or even crosses a line.
Gosh, there's a lot in that, Vivian.
It's
I
a deep
think
subject.
it's a very big subject. If I just break it down into bits. So the first part is, how do you know when people are using humour in a way which is showing their distress? And that's quite difficult because people will be in a situation where it is actually challenging their humanity. So that's a really difficult situation. And they may not initially see things as funny, but it's that juxtaposition between the horror and the kind of randomness of life. So, for example, I remember dealing with, I think it was a firefighter after a rail crash, and they were trying to release a body because in their mind, the most important thing in their mind is that the families want to know where their family member is, and they don't want them to be mauled up in a train. So he was underneath the person trying to release him. The body fell onto him, and someone came along and said, "Where are you? Where is it?" And he said, "The thing that I need is 2 feet away." Now, that is not funny at all unless you're in that situation where there's body parts around you. That's a really clear explanation. It only becomes funny when you see that the way we use language and the situation we're in, the juxtaposition makes it funny. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. For me, black humour is generally in context. I guess that's the only way I can sort of describe it, in the moment.
It is. When do you know that it's not right? It's when it's to abuse or to discriminate against someone, or it's against the victim or somebody that's been harmed. That is never right. And our research showed that very, very clearly. No one would make jokes about victims of a disaster or some other difficult situation they've been through. The only jokes would be made about the situation and how they were handling it.
I think I'd agree with that. Just to add some context, is that it's probably not clear for your listeners or viewers. In the introduction, that I was a police officer for 30 years in the UK prior to going into the research realm. However, I must stress that when I was in the police, things were slightly different in relation to the exposure to dark humour. And particularly, I'm talking about people's use of mobile phones to record emergency services activities, even body cameras, body-worn videos that officers wear now that record things live. And I think that adds an extra dimension to dark humour. And I'm not saying in my era we got away with it or it didn't happen, but it wasn't quite as in the public eye. And I think the officers now in emergency services have got an almost impossible task, how they deal with that in the moment, and then how they deal with the media scrutiny or attention afterwards. I must say that some of our own goals where officers post things, or they have WhatsApp groups that are then exposed under various different circumstances, which doesn't help. And I am not sure whether pushing the sort of dark humour underground, if you will, is a particularly good thing or not. And also in my service, we didn't have access to people like Noreen and the sort of clinical aspects of it to understand what's exactly going on with us, why we make these remarks, why we behave like we do, expecting to be excused for circumstances that onlookers would find probably appalling or at least offensive. And I think it's very, very difficult, and it's getting more and more difficult now. And we see the introduction of things like AI, which are sort of making things up or embellishing situations. And you've got situations now where it's almost daily on the news in the UK, where you've got multiple perspectives of the same incident from lots of different people being uploaded And then there's almost like a public scrutiny of the situation. And officers find themselves right in the middle of that. And further with paper Noreen and I are developing at the moment, is they find themselves in trouble with the organisation and then find themselves unsupported by the organisation in terms of being suspended or put on restricted duties or alternative duties or things of that nature, but cast aside from their identity. And I think that's really difficult. But officers in all the emergency services, I may sort of default to police during this, Vivian, because that's the sort of
okay.
profession I was in. But I generally do refer to this, having worked now for some time within emergency services generally, to all emergency services. And when I say generally, that's sort of globally as well. We've done a lot
it's
of work.
interesting. Yeah, no, it's so true. I mean, I was reading the other day about these new smart glasses that record you, and so they film as well as record, and you can't even tell. So I know here I'm Googling going, how can I tell when someone's wearing smart glasses, because I think it's just so rude and totally inappropriate. But you just never know anymore. That's the thing, isn't it? You just, everyone's got a camera and a video on their phone. They've got little recorders in their pockets. I don't know. It's everywhere now.
The smart glasses actually can give you cues in your ear for responses to the conversation. The meta glasses, very clever.
I haven't read that.
And they have earpieces in, and they can respond. The initial use, I believe, was to translate from foreign languages. So you can have a conversation with somebody and it's interpreted in your ear, but people use it for different things now in response to questions that they're asked. They're supposed to have a light on the front of the lights when it's recorded, by the way.
So, Vivian, could I just come back on one, because I don't want to miss this.
Yes, sure.
One of the things that you should look out for in colleagues, if you're working with somebody, on when they are okay and when they're not, when they're using humour, is it introverted humour or is it extroverted humour? So if somebody is making fun of themselves, just look at what I've done, haven't I made a mess of it? That kind of, laugh at me, that is always negative. That is showing that they are not coping with the situation because they're making fun of themselves. When it's extroverted humour, that they are making fun of the situation that they're in, it's outside themselves, then that is healthy. So one of the real key things to look for in your colleagues is, are they laughing at themselves or are they laughing at the situation? Because I would always be worried about somebody that I see laughing at themselves, and I'd be thinking they need a referral. They need to be talking to someone.
That's really interesting, because I would have thought it would be the other way around.
It's not. It's when you're self-deprecating, when you're making yourself appear to be less than who you are, that's not good for your self-esteem and your ego. And it's just showing that you're gradually losing that sense of self, and sense of purpose, which is so important in the work that you do.
Yeah, okay. I know that you mentioned before, when we had a conversation before, discussing about doing this podcast, you mentioned that sometimes in major trauma, the small unexpected moments are the ones that can actually overwhelm responders, and that's part of what leaders should be aware of. And I know that you used an example of a responder, I can't remember whether it was pulling bodies as part of a bombing, and then a senior officer came on site and just had an off-the-cuff comment that had a lot of repercussions after that.
Yeah, so this was the London bombings, and officers, firefighters were involved in King's Cross, and they were bringing bodies and body parts out. And obviously this is, manual work. It's difficult work. And clearly when you're doing that, you're not going to be the smartest, because you're covered with body fluids and everything else. And unbelievably, a senior officer went into that station and criticised the people for not wearing their helmets, which was kind of unbelievably crass. But then if you think about the situation from every perspective, the senior officer had absolutely nothing that they could do to change anything. And they kind of reverted back to the one thing that they thought they could control, is how should the officers look? So to me, that had a massively negative effect but it is demonstrating that at a senior level, sometimes people revert back to an authoritarian position because that's the only thing that they know that they can do. They found it very difficult to empathize with the circumstances of the officers. So it's kind of difficult, and I think that's a really good example of how complex this situation is and how many different layers you've got to look at when you're dealing with dark humour.
Yeah, it's interesting. If I go back through my career, when I've worked as a team leader, I think once it was a very big learning experience for me. I had an off-the-cuff comment, and I'd made all these decisions with the team, and when I walked in late one morning, because we used to do work in the evenings as well, so sometimes you wouldn't come in till 10 or 11, and they'd undone all the decisions that I'd made. And they were doing it in good faith, and I just walked in and I just sort of said, well, I'm the team leader and I make the decisions. That was it. And I just lost my team from that moment forward. And it just really demonstrates about that emotional disconnect and the pressures that we face at times, whether we're a leader, whether we're at the coalface, whether we're sitting back in the command center. You know, we all face these emotional issues, and yeah, it was a very good learning experience for me back then.
I think one of the differences you highlight, Vivi, with normal leadership roles is that there's slow time, and in emergency services, the spontaneity requires updates on decisions, and things change really quickly. So when you come back off duty, there might have been an absolute U-turn in the approach to an incident for circumstances that you're not yet aware of. That wouldn't normally happen in most organisational settings. And I think in emergency services, things change that often. You think, well, I made this decision to do this tip. For example, missing persons, where new information comes to light and it changes the whole search parameter. So you can't expect to be updated on that constantly. You see time and time again, officers with supervisory responsibilities, they can't let it go and go home, even though these things are lasting 12 and 14 hours. They're sort of monitoring the radios, or in modern times now, you can monitor the log from home through smartphones and such. So they're carrying on monitoring it rather than detaching from it. And I think sometimes that's it's not perhaps in the realm of dark humour, but it sort of goes to explain what's going on for people. But you do get dark humour then switching on to the team, so they can't let go of that supervisor, and control freaks and things like that, which is not meant really in a deprecating way, but it's their way to respond to your eagerness to help. And I think once people understand what's actually going on, it's a lot easier for people to understand why these things emerge. And it's that, Noreen explained the introversion and extroversion before, which is counter to what most people would think. But once you understand what's actually going on, it makes it a hell of a lot easier to sort of live with what's going on and accept that these are just release valves in a way that help.
Yeah,
They're not meant to offend anybody or to create tension. They just releases in the moment to spontaneous incident.
it's so fascinating what you guys are saying, because if I look back over my 40 years working in emergency management, and it hasn't all been in firefighting, I know that I use black humour, and I know I've used it a lot, especially when you're actually on the fireground, when you're in the heat of things. I could not tell you a single thing I said or how I did it or anything, but I know I've done it, but there's absolutely no recollection of it. So I guess that relates back to that releasing that pressure valve for a short period of time to allow you to keep moving forward and doing what you're doing. But when I was thinking about that the other day, I'm thinking I can even see myself standing there and sharing it with the person that's next to me, you know, in the truck, whether we're, you know, in a really bad fire flare up or whatever. But I could never ever tell you anything that we said or any of the context for it. But I just know we did it.
I think the thing about that, Vivian, is that is one of the trauma reactions, you know, that we have this avoidance. I mean, it sounds like you're consciously avoiding something, but it's not as simple as that. It is a psychological distancing. So you don't remember the context. So in a crisis situation, you're hyper aroused. You can do more. You think much quicker than you do normally because you're solving problems, because your life depends on it or other people's lives depend on it. So think much, much quicker than normal. You're detached from your feelings, and this is automatic when you're in this trauma situation. This is how human brains work. You're detached from the situation emotionally, so that avoidance takes place. But in that situation, you don't remember everything. I remember talking to someone who cordoned off a whole area, and he said, I saw it on the television when I got home, and it was me that did it, but I can't actually remember cordoning that area off because it was dangerous, because it wasn't something, I did it automatically. So you go into this automatic pilot state, which is what you're trained to do. But when you come back to look at it, you don't remember what you did or why you did it. Can I just come to one other thing on the trauma side, where dark humour is kind of difficult? There was a situation where there was a big explosion and lots of people were burnt. And I'm sure your firefighting listeners will remember and recognise that there is a particular smell when bodies are burning.
Yes.
And that smell is also kind of smelled, and it does smell like a barbecue. It does smell that kind of, meat type smell. And there was a situation where a very young person on this kind of rescue scene put something about it's like being at a barbecue. Now that was a distanced comment. It wasn't really meant to be funny, but it was a way of explaining to other people what she was thinking at that time. Unfortunately, that was recorded up into social media and she was sacked because that appeared that she was making fun of the people that had died, which was not the case at all. What I know is that very often when I'm dealing with firefighters or anyone who dealt with fires, is that the smell of the situation is one of the senses that causes the most problem going forward. And so therefore, distancing yourself from that smell is really important if you're going to keep on working. Because if you are connecting yourself up to this is just like being at home at a barbecue, then that's not going to help you get through that situation. You need to distance yourself in order to cope.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You both noted that people are sometimes disciplined for their humour that is a coping mechanism. I'm just sort of thinking, how can organisations then distinguish inappropriate behaviour from legitimate coping humour so they're not punished unfairly, as you've just described?
I think the essence from that becomes the quality of the leaders that are in the emergency services, and to some extent the training they have. One of the issues for emergency services in the UK at the moment is the turnover and the relative youth of the serving operational officers, and that sort of crosses over to some supervisors who are still very young in service, or even tutors that are tutoring brand new officers. And probably some of the lack of life experiences doesn't help in situation. So they default to the actual letter of the regulation that they're enforcing. So they're almost going through a checklist with the person they're the subject of the complaint or the comments that have been made. And then on top of that, there's also now a tendency to, it's not quite whistleblowing, but it's a tendency to tell all when it's clearly not advantageous to do so. So if you have a close-knit team of maybe 10 or 12 officers, and then 2 or 3 of them are running to the supervisor every 5 minutes saying, he said this, she said that, he did this, she did that. It's not healthy for that team as a whole. And then when you go to an incident where you all have to really join in, it doesn't quite work as well, in my experience. And I think that becomes, it's an increasing problem now, because the people that are making the comments are then instantly being pressurized by thinking, oh, they're going to get in trouble. So they're bottling those up, which sometimes is not helpful either. On top of that, we've also got reductions in estate or facilities to sort of hot debrief, sort of buildings, so stations, canteens, things like that, where normally a good supervisor after a particularly tricky incident would get the team back to the station and have a debrief and make sure everybody's okay. Those facilities now are being reduced under cost-saving measures, and doing those things in the open air in front of the gaze of public or people with cameras is not very professional at all. And we find that these things then don't happen as a consequence of that. So everything's bottled up. Probably Noreen could take you to the next step of what that then results in.
I think, Vivian, we talked a bit earlier about this isn't a very widely researched area.
Yes.
I think because it's not widely researched, almost it isn't recognised and no one knows what to do about it. Because it's one of those, too hard to fix kind of problems. And one of the main reasons I wanted to write the paper in the first place was that I needed it to come out of the dark, because this is not something that is just affecting firefighters and police. It's in hospitals, it's all over the place where dark humour is being used. But in all of these situations, it's kind of been used undercover. And in a way, what I wanted to do was to bring it out into the open so that the public understood what its purpose was in emergency services and other difficult roles that people do. Undertakers, all sorts of people are in a similar situation. Because until we name it and explain why it is positive in many ways, then the organisation doesn't have a framework in which to address it. So really, the paper was just the first step in what we really want to achieve. So having established that it has benefits, having established that it's widely used, having established that things like body-worn cameras cause problems, what does the organisation... and also that younger people don't understand it. So what does the organisation need to be able to look at in order to answer the problem about how can we... Because once you can ask the right question, you can get to an answer. At the moment, we're not asking a question.
Yeah.
How do you allow people to, diffuse, get rid of the emotion at the event and immediately afterwards? It's that sort of first period. How can you allow people to do that in a way which is acceptable for the organisation, understood by the public, and safe for the person? It's those three you've got to kind of manage to get through. So the organisation, I really think, needs to be very clear on what is okay and what isn't okay. Rules about what you put on social media would be sensible. Training and rules don't put things that could cause problems to you. And this is why you do it. So you need training, because the young people put everything on social media. They live through social media. So you've got to kind of look at this in a different way. What does society need to understand? Society needs to understand that those conversations that happen, the making light of something which is horrendous, allows your emergency service people to survive, because otherwise they're all going to be ill. And what does the person need to know? The person needs to know that this is going to help them. This is how we talk about these things. This is why it's important. So when we go, if there is in the organisation, this is reported, how does the organisation look at it? Do they have this framework that allows people to say what is necessary to get them through a difficult situation, but doesn't allow demeaning, bullying, harassment, undermining minorities, intimidating colleagues, all of those nasty things that aren't actually part of dark humour at all. They are, I don't know what you'd call it, but it's unacceptable humour where you're going through those sorts of things. It's about the intention. Why are we laughing at this situation? We're laughing because if we don't, we cry.
Yeah.
And we can't
That's
cry.
so true. I guess some of the times I think about with new recruits, and you touched on this, Ian, that sometimes because they haven't got that exposure, they haven't got the cool heads, like some of the more experienced have, where you just get in, get the job done, get out sort of thing. But some of the new recruits potentially find that the dark humour is confronting, or that it's misread as being callous. And we keep coming back to, it's like, I guess, a bit like a shield that we use to cope. And I'm not sure how we teach the younger people. And I guess that comes back to what you're saying, Noreen, about having guidelines, and maybe we do examples or case studies. I don't really know what the answers are, but what I'm getting out of this conversation is we really have to understand what healthy humour looks like. And that first point that you talked about before about are you doing it against yourself or about the actual external environment that you're in? As I said, I thought it would have been the other way around, but it's actually not. So that's going to change my point of view. So I guess, Ian, you also mentioned about a turnover or a loss of staff. I think when we were talking before the podcast, I think you said it was about 8% turnover at one stage. I don't know how we help them understand the differences between coping humour and humour that crosses the line.
Yeah, I think it was 6%. I'll check on the number, but I think it was a 6% turnover at the moment. But I was just interested then, Vivian, with what you said about the talking about caseloads and the stresses of handling caseloads. And I just noted down, you're handling sort of in a sort of emotional way. I know Noreen has a very good example about empathy and sympathy and how emergency responders deal with both of those things and the dangers of one against the other. But I was wondering whether, when we talk about that sort of firefighters, paramedics, need departments in hospitals, police, whether those physical stresses add to like what would normally be a caseload, which is desk-based, which is challenging in terms of sort of an interaction with somebody discussing what they're doing, like an interview or something like that. That versus against something like fighting a fire or in a big fight or doing disaster recovery, which is got that element of real hard manual labour about it, whether you like it or not. And whether that, because I've seen over my career, it's when you're sort of been like running up and down a corner line or you've been at the scene of an accident, you're moving things, and lots of physical things are on top of the emotional aspects as well. There's things going on up the road and you've no idea what they are, but they're being briefed on another channel, etc. Against the things where you just sort of sat having like a conversation with somebody, trying to examine what's happened in a situation, whether those physical aspects actually add to the tendency to sort of make things up. And if I'm thinking about my own experiences, it's within those sort of jobs where the odd quip comes out, as you're moving something or carrying something, or you're sweating, or, you put your helmet up, or you're relieved from a serial line for a while. And then you go and sort of sit and basically recover physically rather than mentally. And then that sort of, we're going to bring up banter here, but banter's part of it, really. So when does banter become and things like that, or harassment? And it's that sort of exchange that where you're all sort of physically drained and you sat there, and then this sort of conversations start happening around the team or the unit that you're with. Yeah,
it's interesting when I look back when we used to do a lot of firefighting in the urban environment, because we had a lot of natural hills and quite a lot of natural areas within the city that but right up against the urban interface. And my senior deputy captain and myself, what we used to do is when we used to get back to the depot, one of the things we'd watch with all the people that we had on the fire ground was how fast their physical recovery was, because that would tell us their fitness and how they were tracking, so like if they sat down, had a drink, an orange sandwich, whatever, and, you could see them just coming back to life, where others would just sit there and they'd be really drained. So we could always do that on a physical sense. I'm not sure I'd be able to do that in terms of an emotional and a psychological system, because by looking at stuff. I know when I've dealt with people with trauma and stuff, the one thing I just keep recommending is just keep talking about it. Don't stop talking about it. Don't bottle it up. Get it out. Just, and I guess for us, we don't work alone, or we work in small teams. But when I start thinking about, say, for instance, I know a lot of the police are now going out on their own. There's other responders. I know even some paramedics are actually responding as a single person. I'm just wondering how that reduces, or how does that isolation, I guess, in some ways affect their humour, because you don't have that capacity or their emotional safety of having someone with you to have that automatic release, because it's just not there, because you can't tell a joke to yourself. It just doesn't work. You can have thoughts, but they're going to manifest themselves, aren't they?
I think what you find, Vivian, is that people in that situation become ill much quicker because they don't get this release. So it's another measure of why it's important to have groups of people together, because we're social animals.
Yes.
Even monkeys joke with each other, so we're from this evolution. It's about how we keep the tribe together, how we keep the group together. And we've gone more and more onto people working in isolation. And with COVID, more people are sitting, as we are now with our computers, not talking to people in real life. And this is reasonable. I can see you, you can see me, we can engage, but it's different to when you're actually in the same room, because you can see more of the person, you can feel more of the person, going and getting a coffee together, and that conversation that you have, about silly things creates that team empathy group work, how we work together. So that's really important. I think one of the things that you said about being able to see people recovering physically, the kind of parallel in psychological is burnout, passion fatigue, all of those conditions that people start to develop, which means that they become more detached. And that's different to what we're talking about in the humour sense, because in a disaster, traumatic situation, it is a natural process. The problem for people that are burnt out and compassion fatigue is they don't come out of it. They are like that all the time, and they lose their humanity. And this is where I think even for this group, they could get punished because they become callous in their thinking. They're much more hardened, that they feel bitter about things. So they're not an easy colleague to work with. My question always is, have they always been like that? Or is this something that happened in their job? Is it that they're doing the wrong job and should they just change their work? Or do they need to deal with things that they haven't dealt with? Because I know from dealing with firefighters and police for 20, 30 years, there is so much unresolved stuff stuck in their brain, which they only really become aware of when something triggers it. And then you suddenly are angry or upset, as you were a little bit earlier, just talking about it, and it's just there because it's in your brain.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to trigger it. And so I think we need to be a little kinder to people doing this kind of work, a little more understanding, and seeing perhaps sometimes the bad behavior being something which is a symptom of something deeper, and let's try and get them the support rather than punish them, as Ian was talking about. I mean, I am doing work on that at the moment in the UK, just looking at how professional standards look at behaviors that are reported to them, but they don't know either. They're not psychologists. So we need to give them, which is why I think, I feel slightly embarrassed saying that our work is very important in this field. And I hope that other researchers start looking at it. And, so we're not the only paper, around town, that there are other papers that, maybe even challenge what we've said. That is not a problem for me. We need to be talking about it if we're going to get the help sorted out for people.
No, absolutely. I'm really valuing this conversation because not only am I learning, I'm developing a better understanding, but it just, for me, it makes me realize there's just not enough done. And as you mentioned before, and we talked about before starting this podcast, the recording, I was on the internet doing a lot of research, and it was like crickets. There was really not much there. And I'm just going, whoa, I was really surprised, because the first thing when I thought about this podcast a couple of weeks ago was your paper came up straight away. And I just made the assumption that there was a lot of other stuff out there. And I've read your paper. I think I've read it several times now, but there wasn't. And that was, I just thought, but it's something that's been there forever and a day. It's never not been there. And every traumatic situation or high stress situation I've been in, humour has always been such a big part of it. And I just had never realised that it's never been recognised. And So yes, I'm finding this conversation really valuable, and I guess I'm not sure. I'll definitely keep on talking about this, but I don't know if there's any practical steps that organisations can do to start looking at this. I mean, people need to start talking about it openly, but do we need to create safe spaces? Do we need to encourage more humour? Do we need to look at, as we talked about before, guidelines for what's inappropriate and what's not? But I guess that first step is developing that understanding and say, hey, this is actually a real thing. And we really do need to start talking about it, because the last thing I or anyone else wants to see, and you guys have pointed this out so beautifully, you do not want to see someone being punished for something that is coming naturally as a protective mechanism.
I think one really quick and easy step, Vivian, is, are there safe places where people can go? Is it, when you go back to the fire station, is there a safe place where there aren't other people overhearing, where actually you can, diffuse all of that emotion? You can actually say things as they are. A team come to me who were scene of crime investigators, and they were redesigning their office for where they were going to be. And of course, these days, making things open plan is what they do. You can't make it open plan where their secretaries and other people, operators, are hearing the kind of conversations that you have with people that have just been on the scene of a crime, dealing with body parts, dealing with murders, dealing with whatever situation that they've dealt with, because they are going to describe it in what apparently is a callous, uncaring way. But it isn't. It isn't. And I think you've got to protect both sides. You've got to protect the people listening, because they will hear things that perhaps they've never imagined. I listen to stories because I deal with people that are traumatized. So I hear the worst part of the stories. And I think, most of the people I know around me, my friends, the people in my street, have never, ever thought about or experienced or imagined how awful things can be for people, So we've got to protect them, because they don't need to hear this stuff that, you deal with day by day. But also the people that are doing this work, need to be able to express their emotional response to it and see that, some of these things together are crazy, don't make sense. This is just how it is. Every single disaster I've been to is full of all sorts of things that you would have never imagined would have happened. Curious things, funny things, things which don't go together. And it's that not going together bit that is funny. I think I told you when we spoke earlier about someone jumping from a high building and landing in a flower bed. That juxtaposition, you shouldn't be lying in a flower bed dead. It isn't the right place. You should fall on the pavement. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But there was something about that. It's not funny, but it's that juxtaposition that amuses us. And I think we always find things that are incongruous funny, So I think that's why it happened. We just need to talk about it more. We need to accept it. We need to allow the true voice of real people that do this work to be heard, why they're using humour. We need to hear that, and the public need to understand it. Not what the humour is, not the jokes, not what happens, but why they are using it and why it allows them to do the job that nobody else in the public would want to do.
Yeah.
It's funny, Noreen, you say that, because in the UK, Vivian, and I'm pretty sure it'll probably occur in Australia as well, is there's a number of people that have resigned from police, fire, ambulance, the hospital, surgeons, that now make a very successful career of being comedians and actually commenting on their experiences of being in emergency services, like shows, if you will, like a show of, and they're telling the most awful stories, hugely successful. And I can think of people who've written books on being undertakers. One very successful book was a doctor who retired from general practitioner who talked about his time as a resident police officers that are retired and go on the circuit to talk about, including police conferences, by the way, which again is debatable, but there you go. That somehow legitimizes it. And the funny, and basically they tell stories of real life situations that they've been in. And although there's victims in these things often, they are funny. And yet somehow people who are in the profession find it almost impossible to express similar thoughts without being castigated, either then or at a later date. Even they're frightened of it, which is even worse, I think. They're frightened of saying anything. It's also the resultant is they bottle it up, which, as Noreen will tell us, it is not very good for your health at all. And it's finding that outlet. Now, it seems almost incredible that the only outlet that an emergency service worker would have to talk about the feelings will be to go and see a clinician. You know, there should be an alternative, because these things happen times a day almost. So they shouldn't have to worry this being complained about. And you often hear officers reporting it wasn't the incident, it was the way I was treated after it that's really stressed them out, that's caused them to be anxious, depressed, and the like over long periods of time, the way they're treated post-incident, if you will. So it's not the challenge stress, as we sometimes refer to it as, it's the hindrance stresses, things that don't have to be there. You know, if handled differently or even well, things wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't actually cause them long-term issues. You know, you debrief it, you're over it, you feel supported, and you go home happy. Officers now often go home without even seeing a single person before they book off duty. We've got to that sort of isolation now, that can't be good for you.
That's really quite fascinating what you're talking about, how people have left the services and then gone on the circuit as a speaker and as comedians. I'd never really thought about it like that, to be honest. And it's so true.
There's an air hostess, I think, in Australia, that was a comedian, talks about emergencies in the air and things, which are quite serious. She makes light of them, and aircraft doors being left open and like. It was incredibly successful situations in the air.
Interesting how we can also turn those situations around from being a bad moment to being a positive moment as well, because I don't like to dwell always in the bad things. I mean, black humour for us is very important. It's a critical part. There's also good stuff that comes out of it as well.
I think sharing humour makes it better. Having someone there alongside you that knows as well, and you can laugh together. And I think that's why it's so important in teams, particularly the fire service, where, working together as a shift, you build up these relationships, and everybody's got a place. I mean, it isn't quite the same in the police because, they don't have teams in quite the same way. But everybody has a place. Everybody has a nickname. Everyone has done something that people can make fun of in some way or other. But none of it is vicious. It's all about keeping the team together and that we belong together. And it can be quite difficult for someone to come into that group, but generally they're welcomed in and they're indoctrinated, or whatever you want to call it, into that way of being, that way of thinking, so that when something difficult happens, you know how people are going to behave because you've tried it out in all sorts of different ways. And humour is just one of those ways of, how do you counterbalance a joke that someone's made within the group? One of the things I remember when I worked in the brewing business, which is a long time ago, but there was this banter kind of situation, which Ian mentioned earlier. And it was about, you've got to be really quick. You've got to have something else to come back on when someone that makes a joke at your expense, you return it. And that kind of agility of thinking, I don't know where else you learn it, but it also creates that environment that everybody's got everybody else's back because we belong together. We are a group. It matters to us that, we can behave like this within the group. We would not behave like that outside, but within the group, that is our norm. And that gets established over a period of time. What Ian was saying earlier about turnover of staff, it makes this more difficult. If you've got big turnover, your teams aren't going to be as strong. They aren't going to be able to work together as well. You won't notice when they're not well because you don't interact enough in order to do that. So I think humour is something that is almost a barometer of the health of the team. A healthy team will use dark humour appropriately. Everybody will have a place. Everyone will understand what it's about, and everyone will be respectful of the people that they're trying to support, because you don't go into firefighting or policing for any other reason than to help your community. So you're not going to harm your community.
Yes, that
laughing
one
at them.
consistent theme that everyone I've spoken to in the podcast, it all comes back to pretty much the one thing. It's about the people, it's about the humans, and it's about our communities and being there for them and in their darkest times. And we go through dark times too, but we deal with it in a very different way.
That's right.
You were recommending it, including humour in resilience training. What would that sort of look like in practice? And how do we teach those recruits to use humour safely? You've mentioned a couple of things there, but in terms of trying to embed it in our processes and trying to make sure that it's covered, because we've discussed that we don't talk about this and we don't talk about it nowhere near enough. So we've got to actually bring it into the heart of what we're doing.
Almost humour is kind of like automatic. It isn't something that you can say, here's a textbook on how to be funny. I mean, I'm not funny I'm not funny. And all of these, after dinner speeches where people try to be funny and it's really awful, I mean, they've got the joke book off the, off the website. I think what you need to do is to create realistic scenarios where people are in a really difficult situation, and explain, here is a number of examples of humour that was used in this situation, to get them to discriminate between the ones which are appropriate and the ones that aren't. So I think it's about, giving real examples or made up examples, which shows all the disparaging humour, but the negative humour where it's being used to humiliate somebody else. You'd need people to be able to discriminate between that and the affiliative kind of humour that brings the group together. And so I guess you need a joke writer type of person to write all of these different kinds of things. I mean, in the comedy world, now I was listening to a comedy show last night because I was kind of thinking, what is the difference between that? You can get, as Ian said, in comedy, where it's labelled comedy, people are saying terrible things.
And they get away
Really
with it.
terrible things. Which would, if those were said on the scene of, a fire or a disaster of some sort, you would be strung up by social media. So I guess that's what I mean a little bit earlier when I'm saying society needs to understand as well. It's not just organizations, but society needs to understand that this humor in this context is adaptive and appropriate. So education for new recruits, education for organizations, and perhaps education for the public as well to really clearly understand what's being done and why it's being done.
Thank you for that. I guess with the research that you guys have been doing, what's the one emotional reality or behind the dark humor? What is it that I don't know, we've touched on this. I'm just trying to bring it back to something that people can take away, that the part that the public rarely see or understands. How do we start that conversation, I guess?
I think, again, if you look at any depiction, whether it's fact or fiction, of emergency services on a TV, for example, I mean, there's numerous crime shows, police shows, hospital shows, firefighting shows. They all of them contain moments of dark humour, all of them. Otherwise, the scripts would be just, nobody would watch them. It's often that turns them into something attractive, especially like films of cop shows or firefighters. There's loads of them out there. Hospital settings, doctor surgeries, things like that. They all have parts of dark humour, gallows humour, whichever way you want to phrase it, within them that are accepted. Nobody writes into the series saying, "Oh my, that was awful." That line, get that actor sacked. But undoubtedly, the script writers would have sourced that line from somewhere. They very often have people who are experts in the field that are sort of doing research on it or advising on the roles and the realistic aspects of them, whether they are sort of reflecting the actual status quo or not. And things like that are accepted. What you don't want, of course, is things that are offensive to people in real cases. So they're not real, they're fiction. Or if they're reported on fiction, they don't usually contain aspects of humour in them. But it exists. And I think one of the challenges for emergency services is to make sure those boundaries exist. Like in many other aspects of emergency services, there's boundaries in what you can and cannot say, and what you can and cannot say to who, and in what circumstances. So I think, especially with modern technology now, mobile phones, body cams, social media, you've got to be extremely careful in where those aspects of emergency services life are exposed. And again, it's about that cohesion of that professional group and ensuring that stays professional and it maintains its confidentiality, and that people understand the many good aspects of sort of talking about these things. And the use of humour is but one of those. I mean, we're not robots, are we? If it gets to robot data, you can understand where it's just a very factual chat between two robots talking about legislation, which would be very boring for everybody, wouldn't it? But I think, again, it's the understanding that there's a time and a place, as our parents used to say.
I think, I was just thinking about what you were saying. In film, a series on firefighters or ambulances or anything, the viewer sees the whole story. And so therefore the humour is seen in the right context so they can understand it. And I was just thinking about the comedy show I was listening to last night. And what happened with the comedian is that it was a woman who was Russian who'd come 10 years ago to live in the UK and was applying to become British, and the problems that she had. But she explained her context right up front of what it was like, where she came from. So when she started saying about, the crazy things when she had to know about when she became British, because you've got to know something about the history and social setting, and the things that she had to know about were ludicrous, it was in a context. So I think the problem of body-worn cameras and the snapshot of what people put on social media are very small segments of what has happened, and it's out of context.
Yeah.
And that's where the problem is. And I think if we can do anything, can we please get emergency service workers not putting these small segments, which is, yes, for people understand, they know why that's funny, but the rest of society doesn't.
No.
And once it's on social media, it goes viral, it goes to everywhere. And there are so many people that are just looking for an opportunity to get at a firefighter or get at a police officer's behaviour as being inappropriate, and how callous are they, and sort of troll them and all sorts of things. So try to remember that if you put something on the internet, on social media, you've lost control of it totally. And if it doesn't explain why you made that joke or why that was funny, or that gets cut off, then you're going to be seen as a bad person. And that isn't what the purpose of dark humour isn't. It isn't entertainment for the masses at all.
Yeah.
It's for those people that were there. That's all.
It's a release valve. It's a mechanism to help us in the most traumatic circumstances, as we talked about in the very beginning, for us to be able to cope with those situations. Well, I can't thank you both enough for being here with me today and being a part of the podcast. It's been very enlightening, and I think the knowledge that you have both brought, I'm absolutely sure we're going to generate more and more conversations about this, because it's something that we just don't talk about enough, and we all use it, and we've all seen it, and we've all been a part of it. And I think it's something that we need to talk about more, we need to look at it more, and we need to embrace it in a lot of ways. I just want to give you the opportunity. Is there anything that I have missed, or anything that I should have touched on, or anything that you wanted to add to the wonderful knowledge that you guys have brought? to this podcast.
I'd just like to say, Vivian, thank you so much, because as you know, there isn't a lot in this area. And if you can get this out to more people that can understand what we're talking about and why it's important, I'm really, really grateful for you asking us to do this.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'd echo that, Vivian. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
No, and thank you. I've learned a lot, and that's what I love about doing the podcast as well, is being able to share knowledge and share it for everyone else out there that may be listening to this in the future. So again, thank you both so much for sharing your wisdom, your experience, and your knowledge.